Okay, let's move into the next talk. And it seems that I didn't get an introduction. Maybe it's because of my first name. My name is Maaret Pyhäjärvi, and I come from Finland. And today I'm going to be talking to you about testing and basically breaking illusions. But let's start from kind of a picture from where I'm from. I traveled here yesterday from my hometown, Helsinki, Finland. And this is a picture taken in Helsinki, Finland, around the Central Railway Station. You know, usually when we, the people, humans, when we go into places, we notice all kinds of things. We pay attention to a lot of things. And some of the things that we pay attention to are kind of things that we intend to look at. And the number of things that we can intend to look at a time, by psychology research, it's been told us that, you know, we can look at 40 things at once. But we have all this information bottled inside of us, every one of us. Implicit biases, different kinds of patterns, different kind of models. And I actually think that the previous talk around metaphors is a great way of explaining all those kind of things that we bring from our past world into the current situation where we're at. So if I would be happening to walk around in the Helsinki railway station, there's usually certain things I personally tend to look at. For example, if there's anyone who looks like a bit hostile, maybe I want to, move to the other side of the road. And things that I don't pay attention to, like the crappy weather that we tend to have almost every day of the year. So welcome to Helsinki if you feel like it. But today I'm here because I work at a company called F-Secure. I've been working there now for 1 year. And I've been working in software industry for 23 years by now. And I identify as a feedback fairy. Most of you would maybe like to call me a software tester. But I prefer to call myself a feedback fairy because a lot of people have these preconceived notions of what testers do. And it usually starts with like one conversation that I had this morning here. Are you the one who finds all the bugs? And that's not a positive thing, you know. So I'm a feedback fairy. I'm the person who comes, usually with a smile on my face, telling that there are things that you did not know of, but I'm here to tell you in time and with a friendly attitude so that we can together, hopefully, address those and things wouldn't be so bad in the end. Personally, the type of feedback fairy that I find myself to be is called an exploratory tester. So a lot of you also probably have some preconceived notions of what kind of testers there are. I think these are the 3 categories of testers we have these days. There are people who strongly identify as exploratory testers. They look around and find all kinds of surprising information. Then there's people who identify as test automators, usually system-level test automators. And then there's programmers who actually do 95% of testing these days. Actually always have, just didn't used to say so. With Agile, that's kind of a de facto thing to say as well. And when I go into a project or into a product as an exploratory tester, this is a statement from a programmer given in one podcast that I didn't make him say, but I took a look at his open source project. It was called Approval Tests. And I kind of asked, like, hey, I want to do some testing on your thing, and I'm going to show it in conferences, whatever I found. And he said that, yeah, go for it. And, you're not going to find anything anyway. It's been unit tested. I've done all of that stuff. So the end conclusion, long story short, was that I totally destroyed it in 1.5 hours. And the things that I did destroy were not the things his unit tests were looking for, but all the kinds of things that he thought his system did, the promises that he had made, either implicitly or explicitly, that he wasn't actually fulfilling. So that's why I want to talk about breaking illusions. I'm not actually finding bugs. I'm finding things where people's beliefs and people's actual needs don't match. So when I go and use somebody else's application as a tester, I don't do that so that I would find bugs or break the software. I don't intend to leave the software broken. It actually was already broken before I got there, you know. I'm not the one who's going to be there next morning fixing it if it broke in production in a really bad way. That's not me. That's usually the developer who actually introduced those problems there in the first place. But I have a habit of breaking those illusions around code a lot. And today, this talk is really centered around the illusions and kind of helping you also maybe figure out some of the illusions and break some of them yourselves so that you're not totally dependent on other people in that. One of the things where I approach these illusions very differently than most programmers, I still also identify as a programmer and a polyglot programmer myself. I've been writing code in 14 languages. But one of the things where I approach things differently is that even though I can read the code, even though I can write the code, I spend most of my time with the product, the solution, the application. And I look at the product as if it was my kind of external imagination. You know, it speaks to me. It keeps whispering back to me when I look at it. It tells me, you know, here's a button. You'd want to click here, right? And I click, poof, something happens. Whenever I look at an API, it's the exact same thing. I see a field, or I see two APIs, and it whispers back to me, and it says, ooh, you'd want to use these APIs, one after the other, put them in different orders, and maybe these particular fields are supposed to be connected. And again, magic happens, and things of unexpected nature might come out. And a lot of times I find that people like myself, who identify as testers, when around people who don't identify as testers at all, but just as programmers, tend to be the external imagination for those people. Meaning that, for example, sometimes when I sit next to my developer, I'm quiet, he looks at me and says, you'd want me to click here, right? And then he does, and he finds the bug that he could have found all by himself, should he just tried that without me. But the things we're doing, it's not really to find bugs, but what we're trying to do together with all of my teammates, with different interests and different backgrounds, is to find ways of figuring out how all of this is connected so that we could actually, instead of just making a great product or great company, we could make the product so that our users using that product is awesome. So there's a bigger context around all of the thinking that I do. So let's go into the first 3 basic illusions that I get to break, usually, on a daily basis. I took a little example from my current work at F-Secure. You can see from the picture that this says nothing about F-Secure. It's Windows firewall, available in Microsoft operating systems. Just the basic, you know, vanilla thing that you have there. One of the things in the last 6 months that we've been doing is making this remotely manageable with our tools. Not very complicated or exciting problem as such, because, you know, Microsoft is nice enough to developers that they give APIs. APIs to the same functionality that you can use through the user interface. So connecting to an API that someone else has done, that should be straightforward, right? So the first illusion type that I get to do is looking at things where the code is doing something that it isn't supposed to do. So one of the problems that I found is that, you know, through our own remote management, user interface, or the REST API calls that we could use, if I entered in a firewall rule, which just, you know, happened to mix up casing of it, a basic, very simple mistake that any one of us do, and we always forget to tell the others what our expectations around casing are. Sometimes we even forget that, you know, it matters. It just ended up with a rule that was supposed to be created, ending up with a completely different rule. And when you have rules that are supposed to block something bad from happening, turning out to be, let's allow everything, it's maybe not the best thing. So very simple things. We just sometimes mean to do things better than we ended up doing. So these are usually the things that you might identify as bugs. The second type of illusions that I actually enjoy breaking a lot more, because those type of things, other people can usually work on those really well too, is the ideas of the product actually doing what it would need to do. So one of the examples around this firewall was that, I was testing IP addresses, because of course you will need IP addresses for firewall, right? So there's IPv4 and there's IPv6, and I'm not a specialist in either one of them. I have done my master's in computer science around network technologies, and all of this kind of like, it feels not so complicated when you've spent some time on it. But the basic idea of IPv4 and IPv6, there's an API already. Why would I care so much? That's also where my developer came from. But I decided that maybe there was just, something more to be revealed here. And that something more turned out to be that I started finding different IP addresses, samples all around. What would they look like? IPv6 in particular, because I had less experience in that. And I went and, Googled IPv6 addresses, copy-pasted that, all seemed to be fine. And then I realized that, hey, there's this thing called ipconfig. I can see my own IP. Maybe I can, create a rule that I can actually play with. I have full control over that rule. And when I copied that particular piece of information, the IPv6 address that I had on my local computer, it didn't work. You know why? I didn't know beforehand, neither did my developer. But it didn't work because those IPv6 addresses have a thing in the end called scope ID, which is actually a part of an IPv6 address. And after I identified that there's this kind of thing, I also found out about all the subnet-related things, network masks, etc., 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 things that we assumed that the API would give us, but it didn't give us yet. And we had to actually implement all the things that there might be in the Windows side API. So a lot of times I find things where the product is supposed to be doing things, but it actually doesn't do them yet. So this might also be like missing requirements, but they are requirements without which our application is actually not going to be awesome, and our users are not going to be very awesome either. So the third type of illusion that I, of course, run into a lot right now, working in a security company, is an illusion thinking that the product only does what it's supposed to do. So imagine a hacker. They would want to be using our product for purposes that we really didn't intend to. Hijacking, network traffic, all these sort of things. And making sure that the firewall rules that we were so hard trying to keep under admin maintenance, admin control, would actually end up being somehow nullified so that they would have an entry there. I don't want to go into the specifics of problems in that area, but it's been some of the most fun I've had in the last 6 months. So that's at least something that I have to say. And it's awesome when this stuff also gets fixed. But in addition to these basic 3 illusions that I break pretty much every day, I can calculate every day how many times I go into these illusions. There's also a different set of illusions that I find that as someone who works closely with the teams, someone who is part of the teams and identifies as one of the developers, even with this specialty, I also get to break a lot. So there's these ideas that kind of lead us into code and illusions around those that we could also need to break. One of the main categories of these illusions is the idea that the process, the way of working we have right now, would actually give us the ability to work in an effective manner, especially over longer term, when we have to do maintenance, when we have to do fixes, when we have to address something that none of us actually knew beforehand. So a lot of times, these illusions are things like changing the process in a particular way for making us better. And one example that I wanted to share is, from the last 6 months, is the idea that we had a product owner in our room, sitting together with all of us developers. And I started noticing that it made our communication really weird. Every one of us would talk to the product owner, and then we would stop. We wouldn't talk to each other. It would always go to the product owner. And as one of the illusions that needed to be broken was the idea that the product owner is the key person for all of this instead of our mutual understanding, I had the product owner moved out of the room, going to his manager, and it actually improved things a lot. And these kind of, small environmental changes happen a lot of times, just as you identify them and introduce them. Another type is the idea that people actually would have the skills to deliver well. We like to believe that we know the things we're doing, but at least the more I learn, I realize that the less I know. There's always amazing amount of pieces of information that I could also be gathering. And remembering the Helsinki example, noticing 40 things consciously at a time, we might not always remember to use all the good skills and especially make them a habit that, when we're put into the spot. And the last, sixth type of illusion that I wanted to mention here today is the idea that the business model somehow, we often think that it drives us into making the right selections. We think we're implementing the right features, the one which get paid. And in particular, in my previous place of work, it was kind of nice to work so close to the business side that I could suggest that, maybe it's a good idea that you sell the feature before we implement any of it. Just for one bigger customer, take 10% of the money in advance, and then we'll start implementing it. We'll deliver incrementally, so they will get some value fairly soon. We haven't done any of this yet. Just to learn that when that contract was actually proposed, there was no money ever coming in. It needed to be included in the already included money, which was, of course, not what the company was thinking at that point. So all of these illusions and breaking them, that's really the life that I live, and I absolutely love it. But I wanted to share you a couple of tools on how you could approach these kind of things. First of all, when you look at something, look at it with open eyes, open mind, and be ready to see things. Well, you can obviously see it's a cat, right? But it's also a bird. It actually says that in writing. But if you look at it and you give it a little more time, maybe you start seeing also other things there. There's all kinds of geometric shapes. Some of them are more symmetrical than others. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe that's meant to be. There's not just the things that you can see, like the shapes that you can see. There's also lines, the width of the lines, how they are drawn. But there's also empty space. Maybe the empty space has meaning as well. And a lot of times, the difference between me looking at an application and one of my developers looking at the application is that I just look at it 100 times where they are looking at it once. The skills related to exploration typically are things like keeping track of what you've already done, self-management, coming up with all the ideas of what kind of things we could still be concerned for, and ways of examining the product, getting into using different APIs, user interfaces, touch points that we can have. But the main thing that I still find that I do differently than any of my developers, and I still encourage all of my developers to think of this, is the fact that I stay around longer. When I think I'm done, I still try to show that I'm not yet quite as done. I stay longer, and it enables me to run into things by accident, serendipity, lucky accident. I never really imagined that finding an IPv6 address from the command line ipconfig output would somehow be different than all the ones that I found in lists online. But it did turn out to be. And I was actively exposing myself to the chances of running into these different kinds of things. So on the perseverance and serendipity, I find that this quote from a golf player, Arnold Palmer, is quite nice. The more I practice, the luckier I get. The more bugs I find, the more different aspects, perspectives I bring to the product, or the more illusions I have a chance of breaking. And Albert Einstein is definitely also one of my favorite quotes. It's not that I'm so smart, I just stick with the problems longer than others. And interestingly, you know, being one of the minority gender representatives in this room, I also had to put there a reading link for you for later. An article that says that one of the most famous scientists that we know is actually maybe working side by side with his first wife to generate all the things that we know him for, which is kind of an amazing thing. It's not one person only, but it's a collaboration in how we often come up to these things. One way of breaking the illusions, I took a picture of my firewall testing mind map, is that I really do keep track of my thoughts, of my perceptions, of the things that I see. And mind mapping is often kind of like the grid that I layer on top of all the concepts that are coming out of there. And the simple thing that started off with us, it was so easy to implement. It's just a ready GUI. It turned into all of this in testing, and you can see quite much red, meaning it wasn't quite what we cut it out to be. And that's really the message here. Make sure you create and actively learn around your applications, being open to serendipity of new information. Also, one of the last tools that I wanted to expose you to today is the idea that we don't need to be alone in this. We don't need to have a separate person doing all of this. And even in development work, in programming work, it actually is a smart thing to do, is to bring people together. I'm a big fan of, a thing called mob programming. It kind of says it here on my laptop as well. I'd really rather be mob programming than solo programming. And it means, basically, that the group that I work with together would sit on one computer, using only one computer as the input device. The person in front of that keyboard would be doing driving, no thinking allowed. And all the ideas, all the things that are supposed to happen on that computer would come from the navigators around, the people who don't have access to the keyboard right now. So things need to be spoken up about. This is an amazing way of both learning from others, because you have to voice out whatever is going on, but also contributing. And it's a way that I've been doing now for 3 years, and the 3 years has been the time when I've realized that I did have this history with all of the programming languages, even though my main interest is still in the business problems and value problems all around. This picture is from an Agile conference, I think in 2011 maybe, if I remember correctly. So the lady there, the little lady, she is 8 years old. She was looking at this group of programmers doing this funny game that they called mob programming and said, it looks like a game I can play. And just then joined into the group, bossing around all these more senior fellows in the group, telling what needs to happen. What needs to happen next? They were programming tic-tac-toe, so she was definitely a domain expert, just as the rest of the group. And when she was on the keyboard, they would tell her letter by letter what to type, and on every round on that computer, she would be knowing a little more of what is expected, how would you do things in total. So I show this as one of the main illusions that I have to break. People think we need to work individually. And also, I overheard this morning here a discussion behind me when I was sitting there on the side on an illusion that I have to break really, really often, which is the illusion of my manager doesn't let me go to courses. He feels he wants me at the office 8 hours a day. And it's really important to remember that learning works so that it's cumulative. It grows on top of the previous learning. So if you use 5.5 hours into learning and only 2.5 hours into the actual work, and the learning of 5.5 hours in a day enables you to be 1% better because of that, you are already better than all the other ones who obeyed the manager and didn't try to learn in a year. And every year since that, you're just going to rocket outside that. So make sure that you take time on learning. In software development, we can't afford not to learn. So all of this work that I do around breaking illusions, it really boils down to the role that I find myself taking in the teams. I'm the feedback fairy. I'm a catalyst. When they place me there, things just start to happen in a bit faster way, a bit different way. Maybe some of the things get discussed more often. I often act as the conscience for my team. Are we really done yet? Do we really think that we don't need to do this? I'm often a cheerleader. I go and tell my managers how awesome developers I work with. They don't see the actual work my programmer colleagues do. But I make sure that they hear from me when they succeed and the specifics on how they succeed. And I bring a perspective of critical thinking. There's way too many times we believe something is true and we just take it as it is and then learn too late that we could have actually maybe acted differently if any one of us would have spoken up about it. So that's my sharing today. Breaking illusions, that's what testing is really about. All right. I also think that I'm not going to take questions here. I invite everyone to come and talk to me. And in a programming conference, I just, wrote this on Twitter. I realized today that one of my favorite topics to talk about is language ecosystems. They are so fascinating.